Welcome back, viewers. We are on tip 1 of 5 tips to better 2009 AXSRS reporting. Without further ado, here we are. Use two date parameters to specify a range. Now, by default, when you have a query range on a date time field in AX, if you add that to the Moxel, it will create a parameter for you, which is a single date time parameter specifying the exact date of that date filter. Now, most of the time when you run a report, you want to have a range. So what you could do is you could set that date time to a string field and then use the date1 ... date2 syntax that you can use to do grid filters for between two dates. However, that is a lot of work for the user to enter that in correctly and know that they can do that. So what we want to do is have two dates which then feed into that date1 ... date2 syntax and send that back to AX in order for the query to be filtered correctly. So we're going to start off, we're going to go through this really quickly on the demo. This is definitely the easy part here, but we're going to start off by adding a new report. We're going to go ahead and call this 5 tips. We'll be using this same report for the entire presentation. So I'm going to add a new data method here. The reason we're doing this as a data method is that we need the flexibility of the data method. There actually is a way to do it as an AX query with the date range portion of what we're talking about, but pretty quick we're going to go over the level of functionality where we could avoid doing a C# data method for our data set. So we are just going to go ahead and embrace it from the get-go. So our method is going to return a data table, and we are going to call it demo cust invoice trans. For people not familiar with what I'm doing here, this is pretty available on Google. Basically look for how to return a C# data method in AXSRS as a data set. You can find pretty good information about that. What we do is we're going to look for the AX query object. We're going to call execute query. The query we're going to execute is select star from, and our query name was demo cust invoice trans, remember up here. So the syntax to select that is as follows. So here this is just basic query that's going to get our data set. We could go in then and add a data set query, and yeah, why not? Go into business logic, and then we select, after we've selected business logic, we look for the query. Oh, it looks like we have a connection issue here. So I am going to save, close out of here. This happens sometimes if you're in Visual Studio and you have a disconnection or a network hiccup or something like that. You can end up with an inability to reconnect to AX, and when we actually run this business logic to figure out what columns we are, we have to connect back to AX. Usually you can resolve that just by closing out of Visual Studio and opening it back up again, and we're going to hopefully see that that is the case here. Yes, that is. So we have all of our columns there, and we don't have any parameters other than the default one. So then what we want to do is we want to add a date range parameter. Now, those of you who are familiar with this syntax will know that there's an overload here. The overload takes an iDictionary of a string and an object for the range values. So let's define one of those. We're going to get a dictionary of string object, and we'll call it ranges, and that's going to equal a new dictionary string object, and we're going to define it in shorthand with invoice date, actually it's cust invoice jur dot. Okay, so if you're not familiar with this syntax for populating a dictionary, you can define it. This is just instead of having to call the call a dot add method on ranges a bunch of different times. This just declares it all to begin with. Now, where this syntax here comes from is from the query we have cust invoice jur dot invoice date. So what we're doing is we're saying that we want to put this query value into that query range. So suppose that we want to specify just a string date range. Then we could do this. Specify that date range, and then we got to make sure that we feed ranges down into the query. And now this object will put a string date range in here. And if you notice, if we refresh after we build the business logic, if we refresh this query, it'll ask us for a date range, and that could be specified in that date1 dot dot date2 syntax that you're familiar with from grids. But we don't want that. We don't want a string. We actually want to ask for a date time start and a date time end parameter. And then what we want to do here is transfer these into the date range syntax. So I'm going to separate this out by declaring a new public static string method. This is going to return our date1 dot dot date2 syntax. I'm going to call this date range, and it's going to take a date time start and a date time end. And then what we are going to return is start.toString, and that's going to be month, that date, year. And it's going to have the end value here. And what we need to do is we need to turn that. So then here, instead of specifying some string, we're going to specify the function of our start and our end date, which is start. And now we should get, when we rebuild the business logic and refresh the table, now it's asking us for a start and an end. We should notice once that refreshes that we get two new parameters here. We can just delete the old one here. And those are both system.datetime parameters. Now, one additional thing you may want to do is support nulls. So like if you want to say everything up to a particular point, calling a null start, meaning the beginning of time. Now we can do that by allowing these to be nullable. However, when a null date time from SSRS gets passed down to C#, it doesn't actually get passed down as null. It gets passed down as the 1st of January, and I think it's year 1 is what it gets put down. But it's the same thing as if you just called new date time. This object is what gets passed down when null gets specified. So what we're going to do is I'm going to declare a date time called null date time, and I'm going to set that equal to new date time. That's just so we can check whether they're a null. Now first I'm going to define a string called ret for return, and that's going to equal. What we want to say now is a null start means from the beginning of time, which would give us a blank dot dot something. So just dot dot and a date means everything from the beginning of time to that date in AX. So what we're going to do here is start by checking if start equals the null date time. And if it does equal the null date time, then we're just going to have blank. Otherwise, we're going to return that start.toString syntax. So that gives us one step here. We could go on, but this line of code is getting pretty big. So now we're going to append the dot dot to ret, and then we're going to append this thing, except for with end dates. So if we just return ret, this will work for if we have null start or null end. Now the one issue is if start and end are both null, then it's just going to return dot dot, which does not work. It won't take dot dot. It would have to be empty. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say instead of just returning ret, we're going to return if start equals null date time and end equals null date time. Then we're going to return nothing, otherwise we're going to return ret. And that'll do it. That gives us the date range. Then we can go back in here, we can make that nullable, we can make this one nullable, and we should get, if we drop a design in here, we should get some nullable date time drop downs. So that is it for tip 1. We will be moving on for tip 2 in the next video.